From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Take two at Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump picks former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi to run the Justice Department after Matt Gaetz withdrew his name. We'll discuss with Cobb, former special counsel to Donald Trump, and with our political panel.
And we'll talk with Congressman Bill Huizenga, the Republican from Michigan, joins on the looming funding battle in Congress and his quest to be the next chair of the House Financial Services Committee.
Consumer sentiment rising less than forecast. We'll have a special report ahead on the political divide surrounding the direction of our economy as we head for year end. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. Kaylee, we're still waiting for that Treasury pick. But we had quite a bit more news today surrounding the campaign, the transition, I should say. And of course, it follows Matt Gaetz's decision to withdraw his name from consideration to be the next attorney general.
Yeah, clear the votes were not there for confirmation in the Senate. And in relatively short order, we got a new name from Donald Trump. Less than 12 hours after Gaetz announced this news himself, Donald Trump says he has selected the former attorney general of Florida, Pam Bondi, to be his AG nominee.
And we spoke with someone earlier today who knows her quite well. In fact, state's attorney, Palm Beach County State's Attorney Dave Ehrenberg with us on the early edition of Balance of Power.
She's on Team Normal. She's no Matt Gaetz. She's not ultra MAGA. She's not going to engage in crazy conspiracy theories. She's not going to walk Tony Fauci out of his house in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. But she will be loyal to Donald Trump. I know Pam well. She does believe in the rule of law. She treats her people well. There will not be mass resignations in the Department of Justice. She will get confirmed through the U.S. Senate. She is liked by people on both sides of the aisle who know her.
For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Gregory Korte. Megan, of course, helps lead our Capitol Influence team, which means she spends a lot of time covering Congress. So is Dave right? She will be confirmed by the Senate in a way Matt Gaetz wasn't able to?
I think it became very clear by midweek that Matt Gaetz was definitely not going to get confirmed, particularly after J.D. Vance was taking him from room to room in the Capitol trying to gin up some support. And senators made it very clear the support was not there. Pam Bondi, I think, is very likely. You know, who knows what may come out in the coming weeks. But I think that she is, you know, much more of something that the Republicans can get on board with in terms of a nominee for this position. You know, there are questions about a $25,000 check that a Trump charity had written her for a race in Florida, and, you know, some other questions. But these are sort of more of the norm as opposed to all of the allegations that were surrounding Matt Gaetz.
Well, it's interesting when we hear from some Democrats on the confirmation process, whether it's Bondi or anyone else for that matter. Democratic Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania weighed in about the cabinet selections by President-elect Trump. Listen.
I'd like to remind everybody that, you know, when the side that wins, they get to pick the people. And, you know, I hope and I expect that there's going to be enough that we can work together, and I'm looking for that. And then there's going to be some picks that are unacceptable. But I also want to remind you that they have the majority in the Senate, and they are going to have the ability to pick whoever they want.
It was a windy day in Washington. Fetterman was saying, for those of you listening on Bloomberg Radio, I want to remind you they have the majority in the Senate. They're going to have the ability to pick whoever they want. Is that the spirit Democrats will carry into this contest? Because there are still some very big concerns about Pete Hegseth, a sexual assault case that was posed against him, not to mention Tulsi Gabbard's record when dealing with Syria.
Look, we've come a long way from the times when most cabinet appointments were overwhelmingly confirmed with 90-plus vote majorities in the Senate. Yeah. It's become a lot more partisan on both sides, it should be said, and that's part of the reason why we now have disabled the filibuster for these kinds of appointments. So Republicans are headed to a 53-vote majority in the Senate. Mm-hmm. That means they can only afford to lose 3 senators if J.D. Vance is the tie-breaking vote. We saw yesterday that Matt Gaetz counted to 4 Republican senators who were not going to vote for his confirmation, and he bowed out. So there's still, it's not a slam dunk for especially these more controversial appointments that are remaining. We're talking about Pete Hegseth. We're talking about Tulsi Gabbard to lead to be the Director of National Intelligence, and RFK Jr. at Health and Human Services. Those two, we're going to have to be able to count the Republican votes, because we can probably rest assured that Democrats are going to be united in their opposition to all of those nominees.
Well, so if we're considering what Donald Trump is trying to achieve here, he wants, obviously, but he's trying to consider the reception they will get in the Senate, yes. For the one pick in particular that is still outstanding that we care most about, Treasury Secretary, it's not just about the reception on Capitol Hill, right, but also about the reception on Wall Street. Is that why this is taking so long, Gregory? Yeah,
he's got three different constituencies, the Senate, the Wall Street, but also this Make America Great Again movement, this base. The people who elected him to appoint disruptors to his government. And, so we have some names in the mix, but none of them really captures that magic alchemy where they cite all three of those different constituencies. Scott Bessent seems to be the closest to that, certainly has the support of MAGA. Wall Street guy, probably could get confirmed, but there's something holding it back. Trump is being very deliberative here in a way that he has not been deliberative on these other very important jobs like defense and justice.
Well, we started by mentioning the name Matt Gaetz, and we do have news from Florida where Governor DeSantis has set the timetable for a special election to replace him, not till April 1st. That's a long wait for the Speaker of the House, who could have a majority of, well, as little as one.
It could be a tiny majority, because remember, there are two other Trump appointees who are to return to the House come January 3rd and sit on the Republican side of the aisle, Elise Stefanik and Tim Walz. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. We still have a couple of House races that have not been called yet. So we're not quite sure what the majority will be, but with them out of the House, after the inauguration, presumably, we could be maybe looking at a 216 House until these races until these seats are filled.
And that's assuming that the president-elect doesn't pull even more from the House potentially as he fills out this administration.
Yes, I mean, there are certainly some others still in the mix. If Hegseth cannot, if he pulls a Gaetz and pulls out, Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, is still considered to be in the mix for the Pentagon chief job. So it'll be interesting to see what exactly happens in the coming weeks as more and more of these positions get filled.
Is pulling a Gaetz a new saying in Washington? Mr. Scaramucci was suggesting that there might be a new unit of time based on what we saw in this nomination.
11 days.
It's been threatened by that.
It was 8, right? 8 days.
8 days for Scaramucci? Or for Gaetz?
Scaramucci.
11 for Scaramucci.
So
right?
Gaetz was less.
That's the when you pull a Gaetz, we know what that means, I guess. There's a lot to be said for this. Bloomberg's Megan Scully, Gregory, Korte. We thank you so much for the conversation here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll be joined by Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan, and making a big pitch to chair the House Financial Services Committee. We'll talk about that and a lot more next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's a multi-tiered strategy. It's strength through deterrence on the national security front. And then, because we're in a global economic competition, it's about making our financial system much more competitive through deregulation.
Let's just show that trajectory lowering, that we're not projecting 6 or 7% annual budget deficits for the foreseeable future.
Republican Congressmen French Hill of Arkansas and Andy Barr of Kentucky taking their pitches to be Financial Services Chair to our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Also, their plans to lower the deficit. You thought the election was over. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan, another candidate for Financial Services Chair. Congressman, it's great to see you. Only here on Bloomberg are we going to obsess over a race like this, but it's a big deal to us. It's a big deal to our audience, and I know it's a big deal to you. It's been framed as a friendly competition between the three of you, but somebody's got to win here. What makes you different than your colleagues when it comes to potentially holding the gavel?
Well, exactly how I would say it is you've got friends who are competing to be the starting quarterback. And there's only going to be one starting quarterback. But we've got, frankly, an embarrassment of riches, not just among those who are running, Frank Lucas and Andy and French. They're all dear friends. But our entire committee is really a solid group of people. But this is a very important cornerstone to, I think, what the Trump administration is going to be looking for, which is to put the economy back on its feet, to put regulations in place properly, rather than the willy-nilly that we've seen out of Gary Gensler and Marty Gruenberg and so many others in the alphabet soup, Rohit Chopra at CFPB. We've got to have a steady hand here, but we also have to have someone who's going to be able to work with our colleagues in the Senate. Tim Scott and I came into Congress together back in 2010, 14 years ago. We were both named to the Financial Services Committee at the time. He's now going to be heading banking. I have had an opportunity to chair 3 subcommittees in my time there. I've served on literally every subcommittee on the committee, including the precursor to what's now the Digital Assets Working Group. It became the Digital Assets Committee because a lot of that fell within our Capital Markets Subcommittee. And we've got some big, audacious issues that we have to deal with, kind of no matter who is in control. The questions around crypto and AI aren't going to go away. But the philosophical side of how we are going to handle the regulators and regulation, both at the international side as well as the domestic side, that's going to be key.
Well, as we consider the composition of the committee here, we actually spoke with one of your Democratic colleagues on it, Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois, yesterday, and he agreed with the kind of characterization of this being a pretty friendly environment, or at least there being cooperation across partisan lines. This is what he told us, sir, and then I have a question for you.
In general, I think the Financial Services Committee has done, in general, a very good job of avoiding some of the more rancorous, vitriolic debates on some of the other committees. We will certainly have our disagreements on policy issues, and some of those, of course, will be animated.
So as we consider some of these policy issues and the areas where there is opportunity for bipartisan cooperation, Congressman, you just mentioned a few things, including crypto, for example, and we did see market structure legislation advancing out of the committee this Congress, ultimately didn't cross the finish line. Do you see an opportunity for it to do so in the 119th, or will it take a different form now that Republicans have perhaps greater leverage?
Yeah, well, we still do have lame duck. So strange things happen in lame duck. I've lived through this both at the state legislative level as well as the federal level. But I think certainly it's going to have a different tone, at least there's a different flavor to it, hopefully the same tone, because by definition, in the Senate, you're going to need to get some type of bipartisan buy-in. I had a chance to talk with Cynthia Lomas earlier this week at a reception. She and I had served together in the House and know each other pretty well. And we talked about sort of what is going to be happening in that space. We need, as they always joke around, the Democrats are my opponents, but the Senate is our enemy and the House of Representatives. We are going to have to make sure that we've got good relationships, not just across the aisle in the House, but also down the hall in the Senate. And that I think is going to be paramount. But, also, obviously, the Trump administration in its discussions about creating a crypto-focused whatever we're going to call it, czar for right now. I don't know that it's going to be cabinet level, but certainly someone who's going to be coming in and influencing and affecting what the policy is. That's going to be important to make sure that we have a group of people who are going to be able to work together. And so for us in the House, that means the Financial Services and the Ag Committee, as we're dealing with the securities versus commodity question. Same thing in the Senate. And then obviously we got to make sure that ultimately we have the United States be the place where innovation happens rather than it occurring offshore.
Well, you pointed us right to this idea of a crypto czar, Congressman, that we wanted to ask you about as part of our discussion before we had a chance to talk with you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. What do you make of this idea? You've got to replace Gary Gensler. There's a lot to figure out in terms of regulation. Now we add a czar to the mix. What type of authority should that person have? Should they be from Washington or from industry?
Probably, I would suspect it'll be from industry. We got plenty of DC types weighing in on this. And by the way, Gary Gensler, when he was head of the CFTC, viewed it as a commodity. And then when he became head of the SEC, it suddenly magically became a security. And here's the thing. We want to declare it fish or fowl here in Washington, D.C., but crypto assets tend to be more like a platypus, right? It's got characteristics of both and some oddities to them both. So we're going to have to make sure that we aren't backward looking. That is something that I've been cautioning for a long time. We have to be forward looking on this. And I'm sorry to my colleagues who are crypto deniers, who don't believe that there's a future to it or that there should be one. The world has moved well beyond them. That is ancient thinking that isn't going to get us anywhere. So, we've got to make sure that we have somebody who's going to be able to coordinate and hopefully understand the legislative process, because unlike most things in life and certainly most things in business, I'm a small business owner. I have an understanding of what it means to make those kinds of business decisions. Washington, D.C. political decisions and policy decisions are very, very different. And only here does the math not work the way it does in the real world. But also, this is the only organization I've ever been a part of where the sum is actually less than its parts sometimes. You get great ideas and great people, and they come together, and it just sort of falls apart. So we're going to need some people that are very persistent, patient, able to work through and compromise on those things that can and need to be compromised on, but have a clear vision about making the United States the place to be innovative and forward thinking when it comes to crypto, in my mind.
So we'll see what comes in this space in the next Congress and next administration. But as you so rightly reminded us, there is still the 118th Congress to finish out and a funding battle that needs to be resolved. Congressman, how do you think this ends? Is this going to be a continuing resolution that punts this into the early aughts of Trump's second administration, or should there be a clean break, sort some funding bills, whether it's an omnibus or otherwise, and give him a fresh start when he takes the oath?
Well, great to be with you. I'm going to hang up now. No, I'm kidding. I'll stick with you. But it is frankly the question that we were struggling with this week. We've been struggling with this. And really, I think we need to hear from President Trump as to whether he would like to have those decks cleared. Maybe not in quite the shape that I would personally like to see it, or he would like to personally see it. But, this first 150 days, we're going to have to be moving very sure-footedly and quickly on so many things. And to have a debt ceiling, to have government funding hanging out there, to have what could be some very serious damage done to DOD and some of those projects. We've got to think very, very sharply about that. And I think the president's going to have to weigh in as to what his preference would be on that. Are we going to pull our eyes off the ball? For me personally, I think having something longer that is decisive and takes care of it allows us to focus in on those things, just as we were talking about. We've got Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, with many of those provisions that are expiring. We've got regulators that need to be replaced, from Marty Gruenberg to now Gary Gensler announced that he will be leaving as well. So the Senate's going to be dealing actively with so many of those appointments. Personally, I'd rather kind of clear the decks and then live to fight another better day, more sure-footed day when we have the House, the Senate, and the White House all in agreement, because we've got real reforms that need to happen, and they're not going to happen with Chuck Schumer leading the band, I can tell you, in the Senate. But we're going to have to really make sure that we're focused in laser-like on so many different issues.
All right, Congressman, thank you for not hanging up on us, but unfortunately we are out of time. That is Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
And still ahead, U.S. consumer sentiment rose less than predicted after the election. We'll take a closer look with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Today, we received the final reading from the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index for November. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall took a look and has more on the political implications around how Americans are feeling. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. Today's consumer sentiment reading was the first since Election Day and shows some stark differences between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to the outlook of the U.S. economy. The survey's final reading for November is the highest since April of 2022. It clocked in at 71.8. That's 1.3 points higher than last month, but softer than original projections, which were taken before President-elect Donald Trump won the election. Now, today's numbers were largely fueled by Republicans' optimism about the economy. The index rose for Republican households by more than 15 points in November, while it slipped 10 points for Democratic households. Here was the head of the University of Michigan survey, Joanne Shu, earlier on Bloomberg.
Essentially, what we saw was that after Trump was elected, sentiment lost about half of the gains that it had seen in the first 2 weeks of the month. But on net, we're still a little bit better than we were in October, and we are now at 4 straight months of incremental gains.
We should note Democrats' overall enthusiasm about the economy remains higher than Republicans. The University of Michigan says there's great uncertainty over the future of Trump's economic agenda, so to expect consumers to, quote, recalibrate over the next few months as we get more details. Another indicator out today also shows apparent anticipation of pro-business policies under the incoming administration. That's according to the preliminary read of the S&P Global Composite PMI for November. The index found manufacturers are upbeat and U.S. business activity expanding at its fastest pace since April of 2022. President-elect Trump has pledged to invest in American manufacturing with incentives like lowering the corporate tax rate for domestic producers and more protectionist policies like threatening higher tariffs, which some economists say could be inflationary. Joe and Kaylee, inflation expectations, of course, are one of the core motivators when it comes to consumer sentiment.
So when we cut to the chase on inflation, Tyler, what's the survey tell us about people's expectations?
Right. Well, Joe, long-term inflation expectations, uncertainty around that actually rose because of what we're talking about. We're not quite sure which of the economic policies Donald Trump will end up implementing and how the markets and the economy will therefore react. But what we do know is that inflation was one of those core motivators when it came to American voters this election cycle, and that despite some economic bright spots like an easing in inflation according to the Consumer Price Index, Americans really felt that inflation was still too high compared to pre-pandemic levels. And Joe and Kaylee, as you both know, this consistently was an issue that Donald Trump was leading Vice President Kamala Harris, according to our own Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling, and helped propel him to the presidency.
All roads lead back to prices. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Thank you so much, Tyler. Coming up, we'll focus on Donald Trump's new pick for Attorney General, Pam Bondi with Ty Cobb. Coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
President Trump has been out there fighting for us non-stop. And if he's out there fighting for us, we're going to fight for him.
That was Pam Bondi, Trump's new pick for Attorney General, on the campaign trail for the now president-elect earlier this month in North Carolina, just 3 days before the election. She, of course, is now the nominee after Matt Gaetz withdrew his name from consideration. So for more now here on Bloomberg TV and radio, we're joined by Ty Cobb. He is former federal prosecutor and former special counsel to President Trump when he was in the White House back in 2017. Ty, welcome back to Balance of Power. As we consider the kind of difference here between Matt Gaetz and Pam Bondi, knowing that Donald Trump has outlined in some of his objectives for his second term to go after his political opponents, to dismantle what he views as a weaponized Department of Justice. We knew Matt Gaetz might be on board for those things. Will Pam Bondi?
I don't believe so. Pam Bondi, while she is intensely conservative, she's authentically conservative. Matt Gaetz, to call him a scumbag really isn't fair to mere scumbags. Pam Bondi, very experienced. She has, twice been elected the Attorney General of Florida, the third largest state, one of the larger law enforcement agencies in the world. Frankly, that 8 years of experience, makes her, in many ways more qualified than many of the attorney generals we've had in my lifetime in terms of experience coming into the office. Remember, Bobby Kennedy, had limited experience other than as a Hill staffer, coming in for his brother, and Nixon's lawyer John Mitchell, even though he got to spend 19 months in prison, his only experience was in private practice and not really as a litigator. So we've seen a lot of people in that position with far less experience. She knows what to do. She knows how to get things done. She will not be unmindful of what the president's wishes are, and she certainly will shake things up, I think, in the department, but not with the wrecking ball or the massive disrespect that Gaetz would have been working with.
Yeah. I'll tell you, people don't hold back on Matt Gaetz when they come on this program. It doesn't matter who it is, Ty Cobb. One thing that we know is her record. This is what we have to base our questions on. She unsuccessfully tried to overturn the Affordable Care Act. She declined to take legal action against Trump University, despite receiving dozens of complaints in her office. And then she joined the team defending Donald Trump in his first impeachment trial. This sounds like someone who is loyal to the president-elect. Will she stand up to him if he asks her to do something illegal?
Oh, yes. Yeah, she's not going to do anything illegal. Certainly she is partisan. She is loyal to the president. Keep in mind, she's a Republican politician. Her background is as a fighter. She was a prosecutor who, fought her way through an initial election where she was running against, very serious competition, former statewide elected officials, and prevailed, and then was reelected handily. She is experienced fighting cartels, money laundering, public corruption. She has experience in all the important venues in which the Justice Department likes to see itself fighting. And I think she'll be, very attentive to what her real duties are. And I think some of the frolics and detours that Gaetz would have taken are things that she simply will refuse to do. That doesn't mean, of course, that she's not going to run a very conservative department. It doesn't mean, of course, that she's not going to look for other Trump loyalists and other people that are loyal to the conservative cause, to assist her. And it doesn't mean that she won't carry out Trump's priorities to the extent, that they are lawful and that they are humane. But I think she is a far, far, far better choice. I think she is someone, given who is available in Trump's orbit, from Mike Davis, who's a very smart guy but a flamethrower, to a handful of other people that were mentioned. And she's far and away the best candidate I think we could have hoped for under these circumstances. And while she'll be very conservative, I have to say, in my own view, I may not be jumping up and down and ecstatic, but I'm certainly relieved.
So you don't believe that she would take illegal action if the president of the United States asked it. I do wonder, though, what illegal action Donald Trump himself could even take at this point, if any of it could realistically be defined as illegal once he assumes the office, given the decision of the Supreme Court that he has immunity from official acts. As he gets ready to take the Oval Office in January, what power does that give him, Ty?
Well, so I think, unfortunately, we didn't get to see that opinion refined as it would have been had the Judge Chutkan January 6th trial proceeded, and she had, parsed whatever it is that the Supreme Court meant in that opinion, sent it back up for, their review and refinement. So we don't really know, but at the same time, I think that there's a tendency to way overread that decision. I mean, you had to have a line somewhere in order to have a criminal prosecution. That's what frustrated the Supreme Court about the D.C. Circuit opinion. Was they said, we don't know where the line is, basically, but wherever it is, this isn't it. And unfortunately, that's not precise enough, as a basis for a criminal prosecution. You have to be able to tell the jury where that line is. And the Supreme Court drew it. They drew it aggressively. But it had to be drawn. And I think it would have been refined had we had more time. But with regard to does it mean everything Trump does in the White House is immune? Absolutely not. Doesn't mean that at all, and it makes it clear that it doesn't mean that. Will Trump feel restrained at all? No. Trump didn't feel restrained when he was there the first time. He's not going to feel restrained now. He doesn't think there is any restraint on his power, and he will act, impulsively and not always cautiously and not always in a principled way until the courts reel him in. So I don't think anything is going to impact Trump in terms of a restraining force. But at the same time, I do think that people who think he's absolutely immune are sadly mistaken.
Donald Trump has talked about retribution, if I can get back to a theme that Kayleigh started us off with here, and in fact might seek retribution against some individuals, including someone named Ty Cobb, if he were reelected. Do you expect your life to change at all in the next couple of years?
I'd be surprised. I'm sure I'll have more aches and pains, but I don't think he'll be the source of those.
It's good to have you back on Bloomberg, Ty Cobb, former federal prosecutor, former special counsel to President Trump. Well, we're glad that everyone got through the election. Let's stay in touch as the new administration takes hold. Coming up, our closers are back with us, our signature panel on the selection of Pam Bondi for Attorney General. Yeah, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino are up next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
She's a loyalist, and she is at the same time someone who's a career prosecutor, who's got experience, who's qualified, and who believes in the rule of law. She is not going to take this job to burn the place down. Matt Gaetz promised to burn the place down. That's a big difference.
It's Dave Ehrenberg, Palm Beach County State Attorney, talking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power, reacting to Donald Trump's pick of Pam Bondi for Attorney General following Matt Gaetz's decision to withdraw. Joining us now, our signature political panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and of course, Republican strategist alongside Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to have you both here. We still have some blanks to fill. We're still waiting for Treasury. That, I guess, could drop at any time. But let's talk about this pick for Attorney General, Rick. Most in Washington seem to think it is a much more realistic approach, disagree with her on politics, but when it comes to confirmation of what we had with Matt Gaetz, that's fair to say.
Oh, night and day, right? She's somebody who's distinguished herself in public office. She's got all the credibility you need to serve in the office. Frankly, probably more qualified than many of our previous attorney generals going in. And has the ultimate confidence of the president-elect. So she's got all the tickets, no apparent scandals on the horizon, which I think you have to say at this time. Yeah. I think that every senator I've talked to, in the last 24 hours has been like, holy smokes, so glad we don't have to walk the plank on this Matt Gaetz guy.
Well, that makes me question, though, Jeannie, if we would have the same reaction to her nomination had Matt Gaetz not been nominated before her. Remember, we all thought this might be a strategy. Put Matt Gaetz first so that whoever comes next seems so much more palatable by comparison that no one questions it at all.
Yeah, it seems like a long time ago, Kayleigh, that we were talking about that. It's so true. I think whenever she came up, she would have been somebody who most people, particularly Republicans, which is all he needs, will be fine confirming. I would say, and I love Dave Ehrenberg, but there are also statements she has made on the record where she has talked about the deep state in the context of the DOJ during Donald Trump's first term and how they need to be investigated and cleaned out. Now, to his point, that is a far cry from blowing up the place, cleaning it out. But there is still some concern about her context of the deep state being buried in the DOJ and the need to, make a cleaning there. And I think there are some people in the DOJ who are there for life or who are bureaucrats who are concerned about what that means.
Well, she also declined to take action against Trump University, Jeannie. She was also on the team that defended Donald Trump in his first impeachment, and in her arguments accused Joe Biden, then a private citizen, of course, in this case engaging in corrupt business practices with Hunter Biden. As a Democrat, you're not worried about the approach here?
No, I think it's concerning. I do think in that context, she was acting to represent her client, and she is a, tried and true prosecutor her entire life. It is noticeable that she did talk about the fact that the election was stolen. However, like many of Trump's attorneys, she didn't get caught up in that to the degree that, say, Rudy Giuliani did. So she was able to finesse or skate a line there. So she's talented. She's able to make a case for her client. I do think Democrats will ask her tough questions during these hearings. But this is up to Republicans, and I don't see any inkling at this point that there'd be any reason not to confirm her.
Well, there's other confirmations we have questions about as well, including that of the defense secretary designate Pete Hegseth, who, of course, is facing allegations around sexual assault. We spoke with Democratic Congressman and New Jersey gubernatorial candidate Mikey Sherrill about his nomination yesterday. This is what she had to say, speaking as a former Navy helicopter pilot.
Look, if you sort of attacked women's service in the way he has, that would be really concerning to any commanding officer in the fleet right now. We have built so much, and it has continued to make us a strong, resilient force. And I would hate to see a Secretary of Defense that had as his agenda and goal tearing that apart.
So as we consider the Hegseth question here, Rick, now that the senators, including the incoming Majority Leader John Thune, didn't have to walk the plank, as you said, on Matt Gaetz, does that give them cover to do so for potentially a nominee, not necessarily just Hegseth, but Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr., or was that the free pass?
Yeah, look, I mean, everybody always thinks that there's this kind of trade that exists where, if you take some, sacrificial lamb like a Gaetz and you throw him out, it clears the way for everybody else. They take these things one at a time. And the first examination is going to be in the Armed Services Committee. And Roger Wicker is already on the record saying he thinks the committee is going to report him out. And so I don't think there's really a hesitation to see him come through. I mean, a lot of people want to see who else is going to be appointed to Deputy Secretary of Defense and other important jobs there. It's too big an agency to have any one person really have a big impact on it. And so, look, Hegseth, he won't make policy. That'll come out of the White House. It's going to be a very White House intensive, policy-driven administration. Cabinet members are not on their own to act independently. So if issues like women in the military, that's coming to the White House, and there's no indication that Trump thinks that's a good idea.
Interesting. What are your contacts at the Pentagon telling you about this idea, though, firing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs along with half the generals in the building? Is there
just with the former Joint Chief on Wednesday, and they're very skeptical about it. They don't know if this is more bluster. I think that they're there to serve at the pleasure of the president. So if the president wants a new Joint Chief, they're certainly going to give him what he wants. The problem is they just went through a reorganization a year ago, and frankly, what I'm hearing is people are very happy with the structure they have, with the people who are in the position of the uniformed service, and they think they're making progress, and they just soon not upset the apple cart.
Well, so as we consider the progress being made here, I do wonder about the progress of this transition. As we've all four of us discussed, it has moved at a very rapid clip. We're only closing out, 2.5 weeks since Election Day, and already we've had a great deal of the second administration filled out, Jeannie. I wonder if you expect, with us all still waiting for Treasury, but a number of other roles as well, this pace to slow down from here, try to maybe drag out the news cycle so you get to stay in the news between now and January 20th, or do you think this is going to be all clean and done in the shortest window of time possible?
I think Donald Trump wants to get his major nominees out. And of course, he has so many roles to fill, and he has never not been able to get in the news cycle. So I think he will continue to be running this news cycle. But to your point, this has been very, very fast so far. And they have, I think filled it out. And I think one of the really interesting things is how many people have been nominated, not just from Florida, like a lot of people have been talking about today, but who are intimately connected with Project 2025 after Donald Trump said he was walking away from that or had nothing to do with it in the first place. So I think there's a lot that Democrats are going to be able to sink their teeth into during these hearings. But I do think in the end that most of these nominees will get confirmed with a Senate that is now clearly in the hands of the Republicans with a pretty sizable majority at this point.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, stick with us. Is coming up. We'll talk about Georgia Congresswoman Majorie Taylor Greene getting picked to lead a new House subcommittee focused on helping the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
That's going to be important to make sure that we have a group of people who are going to be able to work together. And so for us in the House, that means the Financial Services and the Ag Committee, as we're dealing with the securities versus commodity question. Same thing in the Senate. And then obviously we got to make sure that ultimately we have the United States be the place where innovation happens rather than it occurring offshore.
Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan earlier this hour on some of the work ahead for the House Financial Services Committee. But we want to talk about a new subcommittee. House Oversight Chair Jim Comer intends to establish a new subcommittee on delivering on government efficiency, DOGE, in the 119th Congress. And it will be chaired by none other than the Congresswoman from Georgia, Majorie Taylor Greene. Back with us now are our closers, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio. So, Jeannie, we've talked a lot about how Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, for that matter, might come to Washington and realize it's not that easy to actually get things done, even if you might recommend they do. Will Majorie Taylor Greene make it easier to make their vision a reality?
I think Majorie Taylor Greene is going to make it easier to get headlines, as if Elon Musk needs any help with this. But those are going to be some fun hearings to watch when she starts going on that. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had it right when she said, "Good luck, fellas," about the three of them holding up together. It's going to be fascinating to watch. But, the reality is this is a serious, serious issue they've taken on. We desperately need cuts. But they are not, at least at this point, talking about anything serious. If your idea of cutting the federal government is attacking the workforce, that's 4% of the budget. You need to go after entitlements. They need Maya McGuinness. And, we're not seeing any of that seriousness at this point.
Maya McGuinness must be saying, yeah, we have that right here. We already started that group. Presumably, Majorie Taylor Greene will not bring pornographic materials into the hearing room at her own committee the way she did the Oversight Committee. But I'm curious about Elon Musk in this case. Rick Davis, when does he get bored? 6 months into this project? Or is there such a big sandbox to play in Washington that he's just getting started?
I'm still trying to absorb what does pornographic material have to do with Elon Musk.
Well, no, Majorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just the
funny moment.
Look, I think Elon Musk is going to have the free run of the federal government, right? I mean, first of all, his mandate is wide, right? As Jeannie was pointing out, it's not just entitlements, it's everything in government. So each agency is going to be getting a deep dive from Elon Musk. And there are certain ones that he's going to have a particular private interest in. Department of Defense, you could dive into that and look for efficiency for the rest of your life and actually, be kept pretty busy. FCC, with Brennan Carr going in there, he's going to have somebody who actually, I think, agrees with his views on a lot of range of issues. So I think Majorie Taylor Greene will be taking the sort of legislative route. Some of these things are going to require a fix legislatively. Yep. And I just think it's interesting that the very first big appointment that's made in this next upcoming session is Majorie Taylor Greene, because she fought like tooth and nail with the speaker. And the fact that he's made up and rewarded her behavior is really quite exceptional, I suspect. But Mar-a-Lago had a lot to do with this. So peace within the Republican caucus. Who'd have thunk it?
Unity.
Just quickly on the Republican caucus, it's going to stay a pretty narrow majority, Rick, until at least April 1st. That's when the special election to fill Matt Gaetz' seat will be. Who knows about the others? How complicated is that going to make the first 100 days of this incoming administration?
It will be tricky. I mean, by some counts, it could be 216. I mean, we know that that's not a functional Congress. There'll be deference because Republicans have won the majority, and so they'll fit out the committees and things like that. Democrats will go along with, I think, the leadership side of it, because even if you look at the seats that are left to be filled through these special elections, Republicans will likely win the seats that Republicans vacated. So But it takes time, right? And
Yeah.
we know that with the Gaetz seat, that's what, April?
Yep, April
That's
1st.
a long time in Washington.
God knows. April 1st, April Fool's Day. You can't make this stuff up. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you, and have a great weekend. While you're at it, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you back next week here on Bloomberg TV and radio.